Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. In this episode, we will be looking at the interdisciplinary field of urban studies to find out what we might learn about ideas pertaining to cities and urban evolution. We will be doing this from the perspective of the city of Accra, the capital of Ghana in West Africa. This is partly to counter the general tendency to adopt Western cities as the automatic sites for generating spatial theory. The central question we are going to explore here is whether it is possible to rethink urban studies and the concept of space that come with it from the perspective of a global South city. Insights will then be drawn from this for rethinking spatial relations in other locations such as New York, London, Johannesburg, and Singapore, among many others. It is standard practice in the interdisciplinary field of urban studies to take major cities of the global north as exemplars of various urban spatial theories and concepts. Thus, Paris, New York, London, Los Angeles, and various other global north cities are taken as the privileged sites for valid theorizing. And yet, as Jennifer Robinson has adroitly argued in her piece, Cities in a World of Cities, the comparative gesture, not only do Europe and North America not have a monopoly of what a city looks like, it is also possible to generate concepts for understanding cities from different standpoints all over the world. What Jean and John Komarov suggest in their Theory from the South, or how Euro-America is evolving toward Africa, as the anticipation of trends from the global South to the global North, applies not only to population movements or the reconfiguration of ideas of democracy and of neighborliness, but also extends even to notions of boredom and the burdens of free time. The greater challenge, in my view, however, is how to systematically and methodologically translate concepts from the global South to the global North and vice versa for illuminating urban realities, rather than adopting any one-way street of conceptual transfers. And as we shall see, the very idea of public transport, for example, can be rethought as providing a key modality for understanding urban social relations if we think of it comparatively across different urban locations, rather than as significant only for understanding the individual city in which the public transport is to be found. All statistics available today suggest not only that the world's population is being concentrated in cities, but that this trend is going to continue well into the future, and that cities will continue to provide the main hubs of cultural creativity, technological innovation, and the intermixing of peoples. The processes of demographic reconstitution that have been taking place since the 19th century and the implications these raise for understanding the differential social ecologies of cities, their negative and positive relationships to their natural environments, and the ways in which people inhabit and come to understand the cities in which they live is more pressing now than ever before. While urban planners, governments, and universities have long had an interest in the direction in which cities are moving, it has not always been clear that an interdisciplinary approach integrating the social sciences, the humanities, and architecture and engineering, as well as technological sciences, has been fully in evidence in the study of cities. And while policy analysts typically approach cities within a framework of transnational comparison, it is not always clear that the academic study of cities in a comparative global framework is the default mode of analysis. Most academic studies tend to focus on national or regional variations to the questions pertaining to the specific cities under scrutiny. If we accept that an understanding of the underlying issues and tensions inherent to cities is important, then a holistic, comparative, global approach appears imperative to help us comprehend what makes cities distinctive, their relationships to their natural environments and hinterlands, and the ways residents come to develop shared understandings of the cities in which they live their everyday lives. This is particularly important as the effects of the large scale global migrations of the past 2 centuries have thoroughly integrated both medium and large scale cities into global circuits of co-ethnic identification. And with the rise of social media, your neighbor may sometimes be the one that shares a fence with you in San Francisco, or they may be many miles away in Gwangju, Barbados, Nairobi, or Sydney. The principle of comparison within a global framework thus has to remain at the core of urban studies. What cities provide us with is the opportunity for the cognitive mapping of the relationship between people, places, and things at both near distance and as connected to more distant places elsewhere. This can be seen as much in the links and ties produced by globalization as in when platforms such as WhatsApp and Facebook allow families and friends to be instantly connected on a daily basis. The interconnections are as much conceptual as being directly mediated through material relations. And it's at this conceptual level that pressure ought to be put in establishing linkages of cross elimination between global north and global south cities. But what is entailed in urban comparison as a systematic method rather than merely as an aspiration? Here, a number of principles have to be established at the outset. First is that the close attention to detail has to be established with the added realization that every urban detail you settle upon is automatically entailed in other details that may not seem to have any immediate relationship to it. And not only that, but that the focus on a particular detail in a specific location may also open up to comparison in other and completely different locations elsewhere. Take a simple example that has guided me in my journeys through different urban landscapes. What do trees and their distribution illustrate about the cities in which they are found? And how are they to be connected to places beyond? If you live in a city and you look outside your window, you will see many urban features, but there's one that you will likely not pay much attention to, and that is the trees on your street. But a number of questions may be posed regarding the trees on your street. Why these particular trees? And who planted them? Why are they so many feet apart? How old are they? Why is it that there are more or fewer trees in my neighborhood than in the other neighborhood where I go to buy my favorite kelewele, a delicious Ghanaian dish of ripe plantains that have been marinated in a combination of red chili and ginger, then fried, or tacos, or fish and chips? And how do trees feature in the urban social ecologies of the city in question? Is it possible to interrogate the path of the trees on my street so that they take me out of my neighborhood, into my city, out of my city, and on until I get an understanding of the environmental crisis in which the planet has been plunged today? In this way, the concentric questions around an obvious and quite commonplace urban element, such as trees, can open up onto a whole range of comparisons across cities, cultures, and nations. For definitional purposes, I call this method the start where you are standing mode of urban research. The idea is to open your eyes, first of all, to the ordinary things that are right before you on a daily basis, and from there to proceed through their interrogation and onto larger areas of significance. I'm going to illustrate this method with two cases, namely in the relation to the sidewalk as an illustration of the effects of infrastructure on social relations, and secondly, in relation to public transport as the encapsulation of different kinds of social relations. Both of these sets of observations were first instigated from the work I did for Oxford Street, Accra, City Life and the Itineraries of Transnationalism, which was published in 2014. The book was an attempt to retell the story of Accra, the city in which I grew up, from the time of its early settlement in the 1650s until its urbanization and cosmopolitanism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Conventionally, the street in contemporary urban studies is seen as the locus for the transfer of representations and cultural practices, the site of a particular geographical imaginary, and the collision of architectural forms, as well as a site whose seeming limits may feed into a hinterland of social and political relations. A division is also routinely made between residential and commercial streets. This division is not directly pertinent to Oxford Street, for the spatial dynamics that govern it transcend what we might understand through the exclusive lens of either the residential or the commercial street. To understand these spatial dynamics, I had to think of the phenomena on Oxford Street: social, economic, cultural, historical, and political, as first and foremost intersectional. And despite the invocation of its namesake in London, the intersectionality of the phenomena on Oxford Street is only partly that between the global and the local. More suggestively, it is the conjuncture between variant and sometimes quite contradictory forms of phenomena and activities that produces Oxford Street's peculiar character. It is in the content of the larger urban evolution of Accra in general that Oxford Street acts as both prism and counterpoint to what is happening elsewhere in the city and indeed well beyond. I used Accra's Oxford Street as a key to open up different dimensions of the evolution of the city of Accra. Thus, turned in one way, the street leads us into the history of the city's differential spatial ecologies. In another, to the story of the absorption of stranger groups such as the returnee Afro-Brazilians of the mid-19th century. Transnational returnee slaves from the New World were not the only groups to be absorbed into the city's fabric. Significant too were the many Syro-Lebanese traders that came to settle in Accra and other parts of the country in the final years of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century, and also the waves of labor migrants from the then colonial northern territories that have contributed so much to Accra's cultural and spatial evolution. Jiggled another way, Oxford Street leads us into the youth cultures of the city to be seen in the scenes of salsa dancing and of gymming and bodybuilding. Finally, this urban key discloses the discursive economy of the city and the ways in which slogans and inscriptions on passenger lorries, people's houses, shop fronts, sign writing billboards, and basically any surface upon which it is possible to write to tell us about the relation between orality, visuality, writing, and the overall social imaginary of this growing and elusive metropolis. As I noted earlier, what might be seen as entirely ordinary or quotidian, looked in another way, actually divulges interesting spatial principles. This is what I discovered, for example, by paying close attention to the sidewalks on Oxford Street. When I first started work on Oxford Street a decade previously, my idea was to be a flaneur and to absorb the details of the street in the manner of a man of leisure and considerable means, especially as this research was being undertaken at the time by a generous grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, where I was based then. It did not take me long, however, to encounter two signal problems with any attempt at flânerie on my part. The first had to do with the physical nature of the sidewalk on Oxford Street, and the second was in relation to the uncomfortable proximity between flânerie and being mistaken for a kobolo, a local term and generously understood as loitering with potentially criminal intent. Accra's Oxford Street's sidewalk is marked first and foremost by its almost determined evanescence as a sidewalk. That is to say, it looks like anything but a sidewalk. And the fact that the distinction between it and the tarmac roadway itself is practically obliterated. One reason why the sidewalk does not look or feel like one is that as Oxford Street evolved into the high energy commercial street it is today, the sidewalk was transformed from a broad strip specifically designed for pedestrians to walk on to being merely the extension, albeit without walls or ceilings, of the many commercial enterprises that line the street on each side. The space in front of various businesses on Oxford Street has been taken over by them, either for customer parking, extending from demarcated parking areas, such as in front of the new Burger King, established in 2016, or in front of Frankie's restaurant from 1997, or EcoBank, for example, or simply for the sprawl of manufactured goods, as in the case of the many electronic, hardware, and bicycle stores along both sides of the street. The colonization of the sidewalk by commerce from shops is augmented by the presence of vendors of various kinds, both itinerant and stationary. The items that vendors peddle vary widely. Pre-loved clothes, bags and shoes, popularly known as Obroni Wewu, or the white man is dead. Fruits of all vintage, but with fresh mango, papaya, and pineapple, to be peeled, sliced, or diced up on the spot. Coca-Cola, Sprite, and Fanta in blue ice buckets. Red snapper caught fresh from the sea and sold on the seashore by women, but along Oxford Street by enterprising young men with connections to fishing communities. Pushcarts with various goods abound, and there are also vendors of newly manufactured products covering everything from dog chains and flashlights to soccer balls, shoe polish, toothpicks, dildos, vibrators, and sundry sex toys, as well as old and recent copies of Time magazine. As a form of quotidian infrastructure, one of the concomitant social effects of the evanescent sidewalk on Oxford Street is that it generates a variety of disagreements regarding the proper protocols of road use. This sometimes emerges in the nature of certain unpredictable events that occur on the street. These are typically quarrels between pedestrians and vendors, vendors and other vendors, pedestrians and drivers, or several of these at the same time. I call them events because of the degree to which they can be taken to focalize a number of vectors, including cultural performativity, urban interpretation, and the local sense of space and spatiality. The messy interaction of pedestrians with other pedestrians, with pushcarts, with itinerant hawkers on the sidewalks, and with vehicles on the roadway itself means that misunderstandings regularly break out as to the proper courtesies of street use. These are not reducible to the ordinary road rage variety of misunderstandings. Insults may be quickly traded between pedestrians and street hawkers, pedestrian and motorist, or between one motorist and another. Essentially, the sporadic disagreements on road use are to be understood in terms of the opportunities that they present for the encounter or clash between different rhetorical repertoires for delivering choice insults in the most memorable manner. Because the streetscape is also governed by modes of seeing and being seen, altercations typically invite bystanders to become spectators and adjudicators of the rhetorical devices being deployed. The altercations are also simultaneously a mode for attributing social consensus to the human interactions on the street. The idea of social consensus does not imply any direct notion of agreement, but rather the recognition of the interaction as being part of a normative social domain. That is to say, of the terms by which a moment might be recognized as specifically pertinent to the socio-cultural norms of social interaction. But the sociocultural norms in this instance have a specifically spatial dimension since it is quarrels over the use of space, road, or sidewalk that trigger the rhetorical exchanges in the first place. The point to note is that the specific infrastructural character of the streetscape, its determined evanescence, is what generates the potential for social friction and thus for the affirmation of what is considered social in the first instance. Let us now turn to public transport as incubators of social relations. The public transport I have in mind here pertains to the ubiquitous trotros or passenger lorries that are also typically the bearers of various slogans and inscriptions. Here is a brief sampling of such slogans and inscriptions. Poor man, no friend. No woman, no cry. If you see me, tear your face. And in trust with God. I shared my insights on the significance of trotro inscriptions to our understanding of the multilingual mix of the streets of Accra in my presidential address to the African Studies Association conference that took place in November, and which was posted earlier as an episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. And I urge you to also take a look at that episode in addition to this one to get a broader sense of what I'm doing here. What is of interest to me now, however, is that the historical ethnography of passenger lorry reveals that it represents an entirely separate mode of social condensation from that provided by the automobile, which was itself a major engine of modernity, not just in Accra, but everywhere it has been used since the start of the 20th century. As Lindsay Green Sims has adroitly showed us in her superbly insightful post-colonial automobility, car culture in West Africa. Let me illustrate an ethnography of the trotro from personal experience. Growing up in Accra from the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, my main means of transport was the ubiquitous trotro. There are many sociocultural forms encapsulated in a trotro ride. For a start, there is a great deal of social commentary that takes place amongst the passengers. These vary according to route, traffic density, overall discomfort, and the political and social conditions at the time. And so someone can start a long complaint about the heat in the vehicle, or the lack of music, or against the kind of music that is being played by the driver. This may be picked up by others, or may be refuted depending on the personal dispositions of different passengers in the vehicle. Also important in the longer distance and larger buses is the presence of peddlers of traditional medicines and also of preachers, sometimes one and the same person. There are countless stories regarding these two. Here is one that I vividly remember from many years back. A nattily dressed young man stood up close to the driver, turned to face the rest of the passengers, and seriously declared in Twi, "Onipa dasani, o spinal cord, eboha," slapping the side of his stomach. Translation: as a human being, your spinal cord is located right here on the right side of your stomach. This triggered much laughter and a lot of debate in the lorry, but the point had been made. We, the passengers, did not really know the constitution of our bodies and so needed his guidance for expert knowledge of the human anatomy and to maintain our overall health and well-being. He then proceeded to peddle some traditional herbal concoctions he had carried with him. The trotro passenger lorry is also the site for the circulation of news, gossip, and sundry urban myths. As I noted in the episode on Jean Rees's White Sargasso Sea earlier in Critic.Reading.Writing, what you and I call gossip and rumors, security services everywhere call intelligence, while business schools call them organizational storytelling. Modes of organizational storytelling were central to the trotro riding experience. Growing up, it was not uncommon for people to split the pages of the daily newspaper anyone happened to have in the trotro and to circulate the different parts of the newspaper for public consumption. Thus it was that the sports pages would go to one passenger and the international news to another. And depending on the length of the ride, each person would act as an on the spot newscaster, summarizing the part they had read and generating often heated discussion. I have also heard a bereaved woman break into a traditional dirge on a ride from Accra to another part of the country. She was consoled by the other passengers, but the entire mood until we got to our destination was somber in the extreme, but in which people took turns in a kind of an a cappella song spontaneously generated. The social exchanges encapsulated in the trotros still obtain in the era of mobile phones, but on the evidence of the selfies that we find on trotro diaries, the complexity of the trotro as the condensation of a social form of automobility is much changed. The point is that the experience of riding in a trotro provides a different form of insertion into modernity. For modernity is first and last a cultural construct, the terms of which are set quite differently between the individually owned automobile and public transport such as trotro. But if the trotro is not merely a means of locomotion, but is also a crucible of social relations and the active socialization of riders, how does this insight help us to look anew at modes of public transport elsewhere? The question can be answered in part by comparing the social experience of riding in a trotro with that of riding on the subway in different parts of the world, such as in New York, London, Toronto, Singapore, Paris, and other places. The social experience of riding on a subway in any of these places is partly determined by the infrastructure of the subway car. Thus, the narrower the subway car, the more predetermined the modes of interaction on them. During busy times of day, people tend to try and enclose themselves in a bubble. This is partly achieved through reading the newspaper, but with the availability of Wi-Fi underground in many parts of the global north, also by staring at the cell phone or other electronic device. This bubble effect is, however, regularly punctuated first by the repeated announcements of upcoming stops on the subway line, the jostling that takes place as people get on and off the subway, and the overall continual space adjustments that people need to make to accommodate the different relations between those that sit and those that stand. There is thus a particular rhythm to riding the subway that becomes part of its social productivity. What is also of interest, however, are the other kinds of interruption of the social bubble that do not derive directly from the infrastructure of the subway ride, but rather pertain to different kinds of personal announcement and appeals for help. New York's subways present the most diverse and colorful of these personal announcements. It is not unusual for a ride on the D or the B trains to be interrupted between 59th Street and 125th Street with groups of dancing teens eager to display their dance skills and to solicit some money from riders. This is so commonplace that on some carriages of the New York Metro, you even find instructions clearly stipulating that the subway car is not for dancing. But there is another class of personal announcements that distinguishes the New York subway from all others I am familiar with. And that is what I want to call appeals for help through the genre of the medical biography. The medical biography goes something like this. I was recently diagnosed with leukemia or HIV or some incurable ailment. I have lost my health insurance and cannot survive for long without my meds. Please help. In one such instance, the person was a decommissioned military veteran and he went about the subway carriage displaying his veteran's card as proof of the veracity of what he was telling us. And in the Christmas of 2018, a woman boarded a subway carriage with her 8-year-old child to deliver her medical biography and to say that because of her circumstances, she could not buy any Christmas presents for her daughter, and so that the riders should all chip in out of the kindness of our hearts that Yuletide season. Now, while I stand to be corrected, I consider the genre of the medical biography to be one that is at home specifically on the New York subway. Because in all my travels elsewhere, be it in Boston, San Francisco, London, Paris, Hong Kong, and Singapore, I have never encountered the genre of the medical biography as one of the modes of eliciting compassion and money on public transport. In fact, I venture to say that the genre would be completely out of place on London's Underground, which I am also reasonably familiar with. This is not just for the narrowness of the London Underground's subway carriages, which would make it very difficult for someone to navigate through the passengers at most times of day to beg for alms, but also for the fact that the British are generally well known to cultivate a very stiff upper lip. And so, to divulge one's medical biography in such fashion as we find on the New York Metro would likely lead to disgust rather than sympathy. This then tells us that as a mode of public transport, the subway is as much a crucible of social relations as were the trotros of my youth in Accra. Thank you very much. Please remember to check the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.